Yes, I'm going to continue right away in English. I'd like to thank you for the kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be part of the DigiCup Congress this year, and I'm particularly excited to be welcoming Shoshana Zuboff as our first guest and speaker today, as she is one of the forethinkers of our time when it comes to imagining the digital economy and the digital futures that we want to live in. Shoshana Zuboff is a U.S. scholar and Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emeritus at the Harvard Business School. Her widely acknowledged book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, defines what she thinks of as a new economic order that claims human experience as a free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. Shoshana argues that the tech giants will soon not only be able to predict our behavior, but to also shape and control it. So how can we manage our data in future to escape the grasp of this surveillance economy? What impact is the corona pandemic having? And could this crisis mark a turning point at which we dare to rethink the global economy and society? These are some of the questions that I look forward to discussing together with Shoshana this afternoon. And as Andrea said, we also look forward to your questions and comments, so please keep them coming in via Twitter. Shoshana, you spoke here in Berlin around this time last year, and the world has really undergone some dramatic changes since then. It's really great that you found the time for being with us this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us.
With you to participate in the conference. I'm very glad to be able to do that this year, and welcome to all of our viewers. It's a great occasion.
So since we have you here live from the US, I definitely want to use this opportunity to dig into some of the current topics moving the world. And I'd love to start with what happened over the last week. And this last weekend, I felt like the whole world exhaled. Can you give us a little insight? What is the mood like in the US right now? Is it a general sense of relief?
Well, I would say, we began with a tremendous sense of relief, and I would say that relief was shared around the world, certainly in America, but all across the world. I had people writing to me from every country, just saying the same thing that you said, Joe. Exhaling, suspirando. So. The situation, however, is still quite fraught. There are still threats. As everybody knows, Mr. Trump has refused to concede and is looking for ways to invent, to contest the election and contest the vote. This is part of an ongoing disinformation campaign, an intentional and well-organized disinformation campaign that was first launched with the 2016 Trump presidential campaign and has essentially continued throughout his years in a very dark White House.
That is so true, and I guess we're very much hoping for particularly a peaceful transition of power in the next upcoming weeks. You already threw in a very important keyword, disinformation. So having binge watched the US election over the course of the past week, it seemed to me like the social media platforms were definitely a source of much entertainment, with the global meme factory pretty much being on fire and a multitude of funny TikToks and tweets entertaining us through this last week. But it also seemed, and this is just a first assumption, that the effects that these platforms were having in manipulating the public, or particularly also foreign powers trying to manipulate the public via these platforms, had a lesser effect at this election than it did in the previous one. Is that a fair analysis?
Wait, I didn't quite hear your question. What kind of effect?
Is it too early to say, or it feels right now like the social media platforms had a lesser effect at manipulating the public when it comes especially to foreign powers or other entities trying to use these platforms to, manipulate public perspective?
Well, I think I would not make that assessment at this point. We need a lot more information to be able to truly assess that. What we do know is that Facebook, for example, had promised many policies in place that would, curb the effects of disinformation. But in fact, disinformation has flourished both in the COVID realm and more pointedly in these last few months in the political realm. Facebook stood by, Mr. Zuckerberg stood by his determination not to hold political advertising to standards of fact and truth. Political advertising was therefore freed to become a very well-oiled disinformation machine. We know that tweets for posts on Facebook from Mr. Trump were immediately picked up by armies of bots and fanned out and amplified into various directions of the vectors of the network. We also know that very pernicious pockets of disinformation were allowed to stand on Facebook without any kind of contest, without any kind of labeling. They should have been blocked, in fact, before they were even published, but none of that happened. So therefore, things like the conspiracy theory, QAnon, the massive disinformation effort around the idea of voter fraud and mail-in ballot fraud and so forth, all of that was allowed to stand and multiply. And so dramatic was this failure on Facebook's part that even on the day before and the day of the election, we had this movement that suddenly took hold on Facebook called Stop the Steal, building on this idea that somehow the election was being stolen, which was itself an idea perpetrated through disinformation campaigns. And this group was alive and organizing on Facebook for just over 6 hours, while Facebook was being urgently told, and people were pleading with Facebook to block this thing, to take it down, and nothing was done for quite a long time. By the time they did take it down, we saw that there were already 40 events that this group had been able to organize around the country, and they're sporting photographs of themselves wearing camouflage and toting guns. Yeah. So Facebook failed the challenge, in my view. That's why I became part of the what we call the Real Facebook Oversight Board. Civil rights leaders, journalists, politicians, academics, a bunch of us got together just a couple of months ago to try and at least put out some emergency flares to tell the public and to put pressure on Facebook. You've known about this problem for at least 4 years, and here we are right in the midst of the high point of campaigning, and then right up through election day, and even right now post-election, where far too little has been done and far too much damage was allowed to spread and have real world effects because of Mr. Zuckerberg's policies.
Absolutely, and such an important new body that you mentioned. Maybe we can dig into that a little bit deeper in the efforts to step up public control, where Facebook has not been able to step up these efforts in any significant way over the last years. And the different stance these social media platforms are taking definitely became apparent with Twitter blocking nearly every single one of Trump's tweets during the last week, and Facebook, as you correctly said, doing nothing of the likes. So Americans made a very important decision on a federal level, but also on a state level in some of the states, including California, where a new law was being voted on that would have made employees working for Uber and Lyft, the big ride-hailing platforms, would have made them employees and not just freelancers with this platform. And I think the world was really eyeing this proposition as something really groundbreaking, but voters decided to vote against it. Do you think Uber and Lyft managed to campaign their way out of this proposition? Can you give us a little insight on that?
Yeah, it's of course a tragic loss, because this is a really important problem. When we embraced, what people like to call Uberization, when we embraced the gig economy, that was wrapped up in a kind of ideology and also a public relations messaging, that has to do with freedom. But in fact, what the gig economy does is bypass the Industrial Labor Relations Act, which was represents much of the hard-won effort in the 20th century to protect workers and to protect workers' rights and to make sure that people are paid fairly and that they have contractual agreements and that there is some kind of balance of power between capital and labor. And so, this great gig economy, it had visceral appeal to a lot of us because, everybody was pretty tired of having to work 9 to 5 in this industrial lockstep left over from the factory era. And we know our workplaces did not keep up with our needs and demands as individuals. But in embracing the gig economy, we not only threw out some of the unnecessary managerial antiquated policies that still, kept us sort of imprisoned as employees, but we threw out the protections that we need in our societies, because that balance of power between labor and capital is what allows us to maintain a democratic system. It's essential to the equality that is itself essential to a democratic system. So this particular proposition that you're referring to that just came up in California, this was a proposition that was brought to the public essentially by the tech companies, and it was framed by the tech companies on one vector, which was, we declare that this gig economy is a good thing and we should keep it. So it came into the political discourse from a strange angle, in my view. It would have fared differently, I believe, if it had come into the political discourse brought by the people, brought by employees and workers, demanding that, sure, we should have flexibility and consumers can have flexibility, employees can have flexibility, but that flexibility must not be at the cost of basic fairness and justice and an equilibrium of power. That is a completely different domain where we have traded democratic governance for the governance of the tech companies and specifically surveillance capitalism. And that's unacceptable. So I think, I hope, Geraldine, that the fact that this was an unsuccessful proposition will be an opportunity for us to learn and to learn how we bring this issue in its fuller context and its fuller import and its import for democracy to our publics in California and in other states. So we begin to get some traction with this. I'll close out the thought with this one idea, Geraldine, which is that, it took quite a bit of time. If you go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries in my country, in the U.S., it took quite a bit of time for us to get those first child labor laws accepted And the early child labor laws, they were partial, and they were only at the state level. And it took a while of coming back and moving to different states and having, different versions that were increasingly comprehensive until we finally understood that the only way this will work is comprehensive federal child labor legislation. And eventually we were able to achieve that. But it didn't happen in one go. And I suspect that this critical issue will follow a similar path.
Absolutely. I share that hope, and maybe also trying to find a way to give people security when it comes to securing their livelihood in this very uncertain time, and having the idea that voting for employment is not voting against less opportunities in future when it comes to platform labor. There's a lot for the Biden and Harris administration to take on now, of course.
Everything.
Yes, quite overwhelming, I'm sure, in many ways. But how do you expect them to pick up on such topics? And how do you think this administration is going to address digital capitalism or surveillance capitalism as a topic? Is that something that will be on the agenda?
Well, I think it will have to be on the agenda. As everybody knows, thus far, the Biden team has said relatively little about their position on tech policy, if I can put it that way. But, here's the thing. So often in the histories of our countries, law follows the public. Law doesn't lead the public, it follows the public. And we are in a situation right now where public opinion in the United States, which, as you also all know, has lagged Europe in these domains. Public opinion in the United States is so far ahead of where our laws are. In fact, I brought a little bit of data that I thought it might be interesting for you to hear, because this is all very recent data from some two in particular quite deep and comprehensive attitude surveys of American voters and American citizens in general. And there are some extraordinary numbers here, and I thought it might be fun for you to hear some of this. We're in a situation right now where 74% of Americans are really concerned about misinformation. 75% say they value the privacy of their personal data more than they value convenient access to information. 77% say the tech companies have too much power. 84% say they have lost all trust in social media companies, and 88% fear the misuse of their personal information. So these are extraordinary numbers. When it comes to Facebook in particular, there are huge majorities in the 70, 80, and 90th percentiles that agree on the following. They say Facebook divides rather than unites communities, does more harm than good, elevates bad actors and toxic content, fails to combat racism, prioritizes prioritizes profit over societal harm. So essentially, and the final word here is that the only individual or industry who has lower trust ratings than Mr. Zuckerberg is the tobacco industry. Okay. So we're in a situation where these numbers describe as close as you can get in a survey to a complete rupture of faith between the American public and Facebook specifically, but the tech sector in general, surveillance capitalism as an economic paradigm. So this is going to be a wind in the sails of our lawmakers. Lawmakers respond to public opinion. And this is something I've been saying over and over, including in the work that I did in Germany last year, to every audience. This work begins with us. It's our public education, it's our awareness, it's our sense of outrage, and ultimately it's our ability to work together in new collective forms, new forms of action, because these lawmakers on a daily basis, the people who are calling them on the phone and knocking on their door are the tech lobbyists. And we have to change that. It has to be us demanding in their faces, in their offices, on their phones, in their letterbox. It has to be us. And I think that day is coming, perhaps is already here. That's going to shape a lot of the Biden administration's response.
Those are super impressive numbers. Thank you so much for bringing them. And I do find them very encouraging as well. I wonder if not many people have woken up to this also now during the corona pandemic, where we so feel the dependency on the very few platforms that really control our lives and increasingly our economies and our political spheres through their lobby efforts, as you said. And I would really hope that we have reached this point where imagining alternatives, true alternatives that adhere to privacy and other values that we believe in, and perhaps see themselves as more of part of a public good rather than functioning as monopolies with lock-in effects, can actually be imagined now as an alternative. It's something that I try to advocate here in Germany as well, that we need to start thinking about building platforms that work in different business models in different ways. But very often I get the sort of paralysis that we could never build alternatives to the ones that we're living with today. But hearing those numbers, I will also be throwing them at some German politicians, perhaps, to see if we cannot reignite that conversation. How do you see that possibility and the necessity to build a different kind of platform economy that works, perhaps, as I said, more as a common good, which is the topic of the panel that will follow our conversation tonight?
Look, whenever you run into that sense of resignation and helplessness, every time you encounter that, you can tick one box off for the surveillance capitalist empires, that they're winning the game, because this is the kind of propaganda that they have very steadfastly and intentionally disseminated over the last couple of decades. So they want us to think two things. They want us to think that what we're experiencing is a function of digital technology. This is how the internet works. And they want us to believe that this is inevitable. So that translates into our sense of, oh my gosh, this thing is it's so big and it's so pervasive, isn't it too late? How can we ever change this? So here's the great thing about what's happened during the pandemic, a time of tragedy, but also a time that has been so intense. It's really caused, I think, just so many people to open their eyes to how it is that we do not want to live. And at the very beginning, everybody was calling me and trying to do these video interviews and so forth. So, isn't this game over? Doesn't the pandemic mean that the tech companies are just going to win because we're completely dependent upon them? And from the beginning, I was saying, no, this is going to be a dialectic. This is going to be a moment when we finally unite in resolve and resistance, because the invasion is so total that we will learn that we just cannot tolerate it. And I think that's pretty much what's happened. So we're at a point now where everybody wants to know, hey, if I'm doing this with you on Zoom, what protection do I have? My children are learning remotely. What protection do I have for them as far as their behavior, their personal information, their school records? If everything I'm ordering is coming from the digital medium, what protection do I have for my personal information? If I'm engaging with my doctor remotely, what protection do I have for my health information? We're all asking these questions virtually every day, sometimes every hour of the day, and we're all coming up with the same answer. Much more in America than in Germany, perhaps, but nonetheless, typically the answer is, you know what? We don't have any protections. We don't have any protections. We actually don't know. So the way I frame this is I would like to invite everyone who's with us right now and who will be to do a little thought experiment. And imagine that you're at the end of the 20th century. Let's say it's December 31st, 1999, and you're looking back over the 20th century. And if you were an American, and in many parts of Europe, you'd be looking back over a century in this thought experiment. You'd be looking back over a century that never had any child labor legislation, that never instituted workers' rights, where workers never obtained the rights to bargain, to strike, to join a union, where there were never any consumer rights, where no institutions were ever created that would protect, for example, fair pay and working hours and worker safety. No institutions were ever created that made sure that food and medicine and other kinds of consumer goods were safe for consumption. No institutions were ever created to make sure that banking practices were fair and just. All of these kinds of institutions and hundreds more were invented during the 20th century. All of these kinds of laws and codifications of rights were created during the 20th century. So imagine looking back at a 20th century where none of that ever happened. We'd be looking back at a century of oligarchy and serfdom, a very different century than the one we actually had. Now, when you think hard about it, and I understand that in Germany and in other countries in Europe, a great deal of this sort of creative lawmaking and institution constructing process, began in the late 19th century. In America, it tended to fall more into the 20th century, although we had some important work like the Sherman Act, antitrust in the late 19th century. But the bulk of it was done in the 20th century, in the third and fourth decades of the 20th century. So I include in that the New Deal, the Franklin Roosevelt era, and so forth. Right now, we are on the cusp of the third decade of the 21st century, the digital century. And the lesson to take from this is that we are essentially walking into this digital century naked. That is, without the specific charters of rights, legal frameworks, and institutional forms that will be required to make the digital century compatible with democracy, to make it a century that not only aligns with democracy, but advances democracy. We have not yet undertaken the creative work and the institution building that was essential for democracy in the 20th century as a response to industrial capitalism. We have not yet undertaken the same degree of comprehensive institutional work necessary as our response to surveillance capitalism. And it is that response, and I haven't forgotten your question, and I'm coming to it now, but it is this institutional, legal, and rights-based response that will finally shift the competitive landscape from one that is dominated by the surveillance dividend and surveillance economics to one in which we can finally have competitors, both public and private, who want to use data, who want to bring the riches of the digital century into the service of humanity, individuals, and democracies. But they want to do it in a way that is completely distinct from the surveillance economics that have dominated the first 2 decades. That means we finally get to use the digital in the service of meeting individuals' real needs. We finally get to use the digital in the service of enhancing our cities, making them places of solidarity and democracy and citizen empowerment and the improvement of daily life without the costs of surveillance capitalism. We finally get to use our data to cure disease and to address climate cataclysm instead of the situation we have right now, which is that a small number of companies have immense concentrations of information and knowledge, and they also have the concentrations of the technological capabilities, the science capabilities, and indeed the scientists themselves, which are capable of actually turning all of this information into actionable knowledge. So right now, it's the tech companies and the surveillance capitalists who sit at the pinnacle of what I call the division of learning in society. They sit at the pinnacle of this new social order, which is the social order of an information civilization. And they have the scientists, they have the know-how, they have the machine capabilities, and they have the data. And what are they using it for? All of it comes from us, but it's not for us. It's about us, but it's not intentional. It's not intentionally analyzed or deployed in order to solve our problems. Instead, it is used to create predictions of our behavior, to sell to others for their profit, in essentially what is a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in human futures. So everything right now is inside out and backwards. It's on a vector that is taking us to a dark and anti-democratic digital future. That is the work of the 3rd decade. That is what we have to change now so that we free the space, we free the capital, and we open up that space for the kinds of solutions that you are proposing and which all of us are desperately waiting for.
Thank you so much for taking us on that thought experiment. I think it's extremely helpful and a refreshing perspective that is dearly needed. I also think we really need bold leadership to take us on that brighter path, and as you just said, to set the course in the right direction. So I just want to throw a couple of ideas at you. I'm sorry if this is going to be like a double, triple question. The idea that we need to have, you mentioned Roosevelt, like a kind of a New Deal, especially facing these major crises, not just the pandemic, but especially the climate crisis. A New Deal that will require the ones that are winning during this pandemic in terms of money to pay into a social system in a different way, especially seeing that we're not taxing any of these big tech corporations here in Europe, and you're only taxing them a little bit, really, in the US. So do we need to really come up with something that is going to put on the pressure for them to be paying into a social system in a different way, this New Deal question? And I want to connect it to another question because tomorrow I'll be having the opportunity to speak to Bart de Witte, who's organizing a platform for open health data and open AI in the field of healthcare, knowing that this is very sensitive data and that we want to be, if we're gathering it, using it definitely for the public good and not for proprietary money-making for a few. And in terms of bold leadership, maybe one good example is that back in 2000, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair decided that the human genome should be open source. And this race to decode the human genome should be something that we should collectively engage in as an endeavor of mankind, and not something that should, in the end, benefit only one or two startups who are able to cash in on it. This kind of idea of seeing things as a public and common good, do we need more leadership in that way? And what could be the genome of our decade, so to speak?
Well, I think that anyone who is alive to the issues of the climate threat, anyone who is alive to the issues of the diminishment and degradation of democracy, is literally praying on a daily basis that we get the kind of governmental leadership, political leadership that will represent the kind of discontinuity that we need. We need to change the game. We need to flip our economics from extractive economics, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or surveillance capitalism, to productive economics that are going to build a future that we, first of all, can live in, and second of all, want to live in. One is survival, and the other is flourishing. So there is no question that we need this kind of political leadership. And once again, what we talked about before, the idea that political leaders follow. That is in the nature of politics, that political leaders follow. And of course, there are times when political leaders ignite and inspire, but most of the time, they follow us. And I can't stress enough, how wrong it would be for us to be in that position of, that Beckett warned us about, waiting for Godot. This is a moment for all of us who agree with the spirit of your question and the statements that I've just made. We need to be coming together as a political force. When it comes to surveillance capitalism, there is no name for all of us. What do they call us in relation to the entire tech paradigm? They call us users. What is that? That's just, it's an anonymous category that is defined entirely in terms of, our relationship to them. We are not users. Many of us are citizens of democratic societies. And we have to claim our democratic rights to come together in new forms of collective action and demand this kind of leadership from our elected officials, our lawmakers. The more that we are mobilized, I think of the civil rights movement, I think of the abolition movement, I think of the women's suffrage movement. The more that we are mobilized, the closer we get to that comprehensive kind of New Deal that we are desperate for, if we're going to leave our children a world in which they can grow up and flourish. So, yes, let us set the example. And this is, I'm sort of indulging in a few cliches, but, there's that other saying, build it and they will come. And that's kind of what I'm saying about us. if we start to move, they will come. And by they, I mean our lawmakers and our laws. And if you look back at the early 20th century, that history that I was discussing that produced so much, so much creativity in terms of lawmaking and institution building, that was the labor movement. And that was people fighting hard collectively and sacrificing a great deal in order to reframe reality so that these laws and institutions became necessary. The Great Depression obviously helped a lot too. It was a crisis, but we're having our crisis right now. And this crisis is showing us, it is revealing that the laws we have are inadequate, the institutions are inadequate, much as the Great Depression did a century ago.
Absolutely, and I am hopeful as you are, because I believe we have to be, and I also believe there's reason to be. There are so many great thinkers, as yourself, imagining those futures, trying to draw up what the data commons could be, putting that into practice in cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam, and really trying to reimagine and show that it's possible to be done as well. So I think there's a lot of good reason for hope, and at the same time, of course, a lot of reason for concern. Here in Europe, we try to, or at least no panel goes by with European politicians that I get to be a part of, where people don't say we need this third path, this European third path to counterbalance the surveillance capitalism of the US and the state surveillance of China. And then, however, that usually ends in a sort of cluelessness of what that third path could look like. And at the same time, no opportunity is left open to not question digital civil liberties and prioritize digital security, perhaps. We had some terrible terror attacks in Vienna shortly, a few days ago, basically. And immediately there was a call in the EU to ban messenger-based encryption services. So it does seem like there's this gap still between the rhetoric of policymakers wanting to come up with some kind of digital future alternative, but really finding it very hard to perhaps listen to some of the people out there who are busy imagining that. Sorry, that was more of a statement than a question. That's kind of the status quo.
Well, I would just say, as difficult as that may seem, I believe in you have some tremendous leadership in Europe, and the fact that there is a discussion about whether it's called a European way or a democratic way. An alternative to surveillance capitalism on the one hand, which is market-based surveillance, and to China on the other hand, which is state-based surveillance. I agree that third way is essential. And my hope is that it will ultimately not only be a European third way, but it will be a democratic third way in which all of the liberal democracies on Earth, including, and I hope in a partnership and leadership position, the United States, participate in that.
Absolutely.
So this to me is essential going forward, and the fact that you have some extraordinary leaders right now in the European Commission who are willing to talk and think out loud and challenge and plan and make these ideals something that are, discussable, something that are real, something that are not simply, utopian thoughts, but real, actionable ideas for policy making and practice. I mean, I think that puts Europe right at the head of the queue. However much other aspects of the dialogue might frustrate you.
But I totally agree with you that calling it the democratic way as this third path is so much the better way to go. There's no point in territorializing these discourses and in making that a geopolitical thing, because, as you said, these are some some few companies and the Silicon Valley rhetoric, and not the US that is proclaiming for the future of the surveillance economy, just as there are countries like Taiwan or in India and other countries that are perhaps even more on the forefront of mapping out this democratic path, which are not in Europe. So I absolutely agree with that.
Building on that, Geraldine, I mean, right now, the EU itself is becoming, more of a complex entity. We have Hungary, which, really is no longer a liberal democracy, and yet it's, so just doubling down on that message, we do not yet have a vision of a digital future that is a democratic future. And that is our opportunity to build. And it will take all the people and all the leadership from every liberal democracy to contribute to this vision and build it, because it's got to be something bigger than any country or any region.
Absolutely. I fear I've been monopolizing our conversation slightly too long, because I did promise Q&A time for the people who are watching us. So I would like to open the floor for their questions now. And for that, I would like to pass over to my colleague, Toby Müller, who I believe you met when you were here in Berlin last year. Over to you, Toby.
It's me. Hi, Shoshana. How are you? Nice to see you
again.
Hello,
Toby. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, back when we could still convene, just about a year ago, in a big room. But it's nice to have you with us today, and thank you for this wonderful and lively conversation. I could just witness now, almost missed my cue, actually, just listening to the both of you. Some of the things you mentioned we're going to discuss in the upcoming panel, especially the work of the European Commission dealing with the Digital Services Act. We're going to talk a little bit about cloud infrastructure on a European level, things like that. So the thread continues, so to speak. But let's look at Twitter, where we have quite some hands-on questions, actually. I'd like to read one out to you, make this a little bigger here so people can see. There's Julius Edling asking, Shoshana Zuboff, do you think we need to create new publicly controlled platforms to circumvent the invasion by the major social media channels, or are we able to change these existing channels by our behavior as users?
Well, look, right now, if we're talking about social media channels, I mean, these operate almost entirely outside the rule of law. So the way I would answer this question is, like, the day that Facebook went public, okay, the day that it completed its initial public offering, something very strange happened. And that is that one young man, his name was Mark Zuckerberg, was given complete control over what already had the promise to become, and has since become, the dominant communications channel on planet Earth. One man. He owns all the super voting shares, so there is no corporate governance to restrain him, and there is no law coming from our democratic institutions to restrain him. So this is an extraordinary situation. It would have been comparable, say, in the 19th and 20th centuries to having one human being in charge of the entire oil supply. It's extraordinary, and it's intolerable. So the biggest way I think about this is that these important communication systems must operate under the rule of law, under the authority of democratic governance. They must come under democratic governance. And once we say that, I think, that we can be very creative, and we can see different forms that can take. Some of this will be publicly owned. Maybe a city owns its own data infrastructure, if you will, and under the charters of the city, we have how is data going to be used? How is it going to be shared? For what purpose? All of that comes under democratic oversight and governance. And, maybe it becomes subject to citizens getting together to debate and to vote. Are we going to use our data for this purpose or for that purpose, and so forth? What kind of city do we want? What kind of place do we want to live? How do we want to live together? But we can imagine many forms that this can take. We can imagine public-private partnerships. We can imagine solely public entities, and we can also imagine private entities that compete in a space that is no longer dominated by surveillance economics, and that are disciplined both by laws, rights, and institutions, and also disciplined by what you heard me talking about before when I recited some of these data, disciplined by the market. Right now, if you think about those data that I read a little bit ago, if you look at that from a market perspective, we're talking about a huge rupture, not only of faith, but between supply and demand. Here's a public demanding a very different form of the digital than the one that is being supplied to us. So, typically, market-based entities are disciplined by supply and demand, but we've broken that reciprocity. Surveillance capitalism, in its very nature, breaks that reciprocity between supply and demand. We're simply the users. We're no longer the consumers. The consumers are the business customers trading in our futures. So, bottom line, there are many forms that this can take. What is essential: democratic governance, institutions, laws, and charters of rights have to be the overarching context for authority and power.
Thank you so much for that, Shoshana. Let me get back to the stunning data you were referring to. It's just one figure that really stuck with me, that you said 74%, I believe, of Americans are concerned about misinformation on social media. Even a higher percentage has lost all trust in social media companies and so forth. And this is something that definitely has caught on Twitter. And if I oversee this correctly here, I'm still wondering, there's still 3 billion people worldwide that use Facebook products at least once a month. Of course, that includes Instagram. I think Facebook still has about 2 billion people using it. What is this kind of, how do you call it? Cognitive dissonance, almost, that it's such a high percentage of people, well, you were talking about Americans now, but I'm sure there's many Facebook users there that lost trust completely, but apparently they keep on doing what most of us keep on doing, actually, is using social media. How would you describe that state psychologically, almost?
I don't think it's at all puzzling. What's happened in these past few years is that the alternatives have been foreclosed. So if you want to participate in society, you basically have to use these channels. And that's why I was saying before that the pandemic has made this an even sharper, more acute sense of frustration and even anger and outrage, because I have if I want to participate in your conference, Toby, I've got to be in this channel, but I don't want to be in this channel. And for a lot of folks, if they want to keep in touch with their community, if they want to keep touch with their family and friends, they've got to be on Facebook. And even, people who are in politics who are not trying to disseminate disinformation, suppress voter turnout, or anything of the like. They just want, basic, bona fide, healthy, honest communication with their constituents and with voters. They have to use Facebook. There's really no other way to do it. So we're in a no exit situation, which is another aspect of the intolerable power and the unaccountable power that has accrued to these companies and certainly accrued to Facebook. And that's what we're talking about changing.
Well, we'd definitely rather have you here in this room too, Shoshana, and we hope this is going to happen again. But on the other hand, we did save quite a lot of carbon dioxide. So there's an upside there a little bit. But there's actually somebody, Rüdiger Fries, who was asking about those data you were mentioned. Are they accessible anywhere already, or is this some paper that is due to come out later? Or there's just a lot of concern on those data and people asking, where can I find them?
Absolutely. Let me give you the sources. I was referring to two different surveys. Both of them were published recently, late summer. And one, I believe it was called TechLash, but it was conducted by a partnership between the Knight Foundation, that's KNIGHT, the Knight Foundation, and Gallup. So that was one of them. The second one was published by Accountable Tech. And that one is very interesting, too, because they concentrated exclusively on American voters. And they did two things in that survey. One, they did sort of, the general big take of some of the issues I was reading to you. But they also did a very specific drill down into attitudes into Facebook. So I've only shared a little bit of each of these with you, but I would definitely urge you to look at those sources because there's a lot of very compelling data there.
Thank you so much. I'm sure our media team is able to put those links together and maybe nudge us in the direction of that data. Geraldine, are we due to wrap this up already, or do we have one more question? What do you think? It's up to you.
I'm afraid, looking at the clock, we're going to have to. Although I'm sad to say that. Thanks so much, Shoshana. The last hour went by so quickly for me, and it was an absolute pleasure talking to you. I wish you all the best, and it's going to be so exciting to watch the next weeks in the US. And I guess I wish us all the best on this path together to change the set course away from the surveillance economy to a brighter digital future. Thank you so much for your inspiring words today.